What would it mean if the oldest witnesses did not simply forget, but left behind a kind of absence that feels deliberate, like a name rubbed away from a seal, like a room bricked up and painted over until it looks like any other wall? In the museums and storerooms where Mesopotamian tablets sleep in drawers, the loss is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the knowledge that thousands of pieces exist, and yet the story of beginnings still arrives in fragments, with edges that refuse to meet. Akkadian literature survives as clay that hardened into permanence and then broke. The break is the first condition of interpretation. A line missing at the end of a tablet is not an argument, and a gap is not a confession. Still, the human mind leans toward patterns. When a narrative seems to step around a detail, modern readers often imagine that the detail was once there, and that it matters more than anything else. The title that draws attention to Akkadian tablets and a genetic mistake belongs to a modern instinct. It presses ancient words into a modern frame, asking them to answer in the language of DNA, mutation, and engineered design. The surviving texts do not speak that language. Akkadian scribes had no concept of chromosomes and no reason to isolate heredity as chemistry. They wrote of blood and seed and bone, of breath that animates clay, of names that fix destiny, of decrees spoken into the structure of the world. Those categories can resemble biology only from a distance, as constellations resemble animals only because the eye insists on connecting the dots. The investigation begins where the record is strongest, in the texts that openly describe the making of humans, and in the motives those texts admit. One of the most discussed is the Atrahasis Epic, preserved in multiple copies from different periods. The story, as it survives, is not always consistent in every line, and scholars debate how earlier and later versions relate. Yet, its core is stable enough to be recognizable. The lesser gods labor, they rebel, and a solution is devised. A new creature will carry the burden. Humans are made. In Atrahasis, creation is not presented as a gentle gift. It is labor policy. Clay is shaped, but clay alone is not enough. Something living is mixed into it, often understood as the blood, and sometimes the flesh, of a slain divine being. Translations vary in nuance, and damaged lines keep certain details uncertain. Still, the motif is clear. Humanity contains a trace of the divine, not as a metaphor of dignity, but as an explanation for why humans can work, speak, multiply, and endure. The divine element is functional. This is where modern language begins to cling. A mixture implies inheritance. A trace implies a carrier. The imagination wants to treat the divine component as a kind of code, but in the ancient frame, the point is not microscopic. It is social and cosmic. Humans are built to serve a system, and the system must remain stable. The fear, if it exists, is a fear of imbalance. The story's next movement is where the modern phrase, "they feared us," finds its fuel. Humans multiply. Their noise rises. The gods complain that they cannot sleep. The complaint is striking because it is so mundane. It does not sound like terror before a super weapon. It sounds like irritation before an unregulated city. Too many voices, too many feet, too much life pressing against the boundaries of order. The solution becomes catastrophe. First drought and famine, then disease, and finally flood in some versions of the tradition. The divine assembly does not debate whether the action is cruel. It debates whether it will work. Here, the mistake could be interpreted in several ways, none of them requiring modern genetics. Some researchers read the problem as numerical. Humanity's growth outpaces the gods' tolerance. Others read it as moral. Humans forget their place, or their existence becomes an offense to the divine hierarchy simply by being loud and many. Others focus on the internal logic of myth. Any created labor force that can reproduce will eventually become difficult to manage. In that reading, the error is structural. It is a governance problem embedded in the design. The record, however, does something more unsettling than describe a reset. It describes adjustment. After destruction, limits are imposed. Mortality becomes sharper, childbirth is regulated, and certain roles exist as mechanisms of restraint. In some lines and later interpretations, celibate priestesses and other social categories appear as part of the solution. The details are debated, and not every surviving copy preserves the same emphasis. But the drift is clear. The creation of humans is followed by the creation of controls. This is another place where modern readers lean too quickly into biological certainty. Controls can sound like genetic tinkering, yet, in the ancient world, control often meant ritual, law, and social structure. The gods change the conditions under which humans live. They do not need to rewrite bodies in a molecular sense to impose boundaries. Fate, decree, disease, and shortened years are sufficient instruments in the mythic toolkit. If the story stopped there, the modern imagination might still be disappointed. It would want an explicit admission, a line that says the makers miscalculated, or that the mixture produced an unexpected trait. The surviving Atrahasis tradition does not offer such a clean statement. It offers something more ambiguous, a sequence of interventions that implies dissatisfaction without naming it in the modern way. Outside Atrahasis, Akkadian and bilingual traditions repeat the theme that humanity is a crafted thing with a purpose, and that purpose is bound to work and limitation. Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, places human making after cosmic conflict and political consolidation among the gods. Humans are created in a world that has already chosen hierarchy. That alone suggests why fear might appear, not as panic, but as vigilance. In a universe that has just been stabilized, anything that grows too fast becomes a threat to order by definition. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is not a creation myth in the same direct sense, circles the same boundary in a different key. Gilgamesh is presented as extraordinary, partly divine, too strong and too restless. He does not threaten the gods with technology. He threatens them with refusal. He refuses to accept the limits that define human life. The narrative does not solve him with eradication. It solves him with loss, grief, and the closed door of immortality. Again, the record does not speak of DNA. It speaks of a line that must not be crossed. At this early stage, the genetic mistake idea can be treated only as a modern metaphor laid over older anxieties. It might be a useful metaphor if it remains labeled as metaphor, an image for unintended consequences, for design that produces surplus, for a created being that carries within itself the seed of disorder. It becomes misleading when it is treated as literal translation. The more compelling mystery is not whether a tablet somewhere contains a hidden scientific statement. It is why the surviving tradition keeps returning to containment, and why the most detailed passages about making humans are followed by passages about limiting them. That pattern is visible. It is not hidden. And yet, it produces its own silence, because it never explains its own logic in the terms a later era craves. In the end, the record offers a creation made of clay and a slain divine element, and then it offers policies: famine, disease, flood, shortened life, constrained birth. The shape of the story suggests a system trying to correct itself. Whether that correction implies a mistake or merely an inevitable adjustment is not something the tablets announce. They leave it hanging in the air between lines, like the space where a missing fragment once fit, and where the imagination still tries to press its own answer into the clay. The clay record does not begin as literature. It begins as administration: grain tallies, field boundaries, labor lists, temple inventories, legal disputes. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia was not composed to tell anyone where humans came from. It was composed to keep a city running, to hold the present in place long enough for power to collect it. That origin matters, because it leaves an aftertaste in everything that follows. Even when Akkadian scribes write myth, they often write it with the same controlled hand that once counted sheep. This is why the archive can feel like a building with locked rooms. Not because it was designed as a labyrinth, but because it grew over centuries, with corridors added, floors raised, walls rebuilt. A visitor in the modern imagination wants a single entrance and a single map. The ancient reality was accumulation. Tablets copied and recopied, stored and moved, swept into baskets when war came, sealed into rooms when a palace fell. The most famous accumulation is associated with Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, in the 7th century BCE, whose library at Nineveh became one of the great reservoirs of cuneiform literature. Modern readers often picture a single, coherent library, like a quiet hall of shelves. Excavation reports and later scholarship suggest something messier: multiple rooms, different types of texts, and a collection assembled through scribal networks and royal demand. Ashurbanipal's court valued omens, rituals, and scholarly knowledge alongside epics and hymns. Some tablets were likely commissioned copies, others were gathered from older centers or taken as booty. The archive was power in material form. Then the empire fell. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE, and the palace complex collapsed. Fire and collapse, which should have erased writing, also preserved it. Clay that might have crumbled was baked hard. Tablets were shattered but not reduced to dust. The result is the typical Mesopotamian paradox: survival through ruin. From the beginning, modern access to that survival was uneven. 19th century excavators brought thousands of pieces to museums, especially to the British Museum. The pieces were not all immediately legible. Many were fragments the size of a palm. Many were unbaked and fragile. Many were packed and moved before they were properly recorded. Early cataloging systems did not always reflect the original archaeological context. Over time, scholars reconstructed texts by matching fragments like broken pottery, guided by patterns of sign sequences and repeated lines. The reconstruction is a kind of resurrection, but it is also an act of interpretation. A fragment placed in the wrong position can change the story's emphasis. A fragment not yet joined can create an artificial silence. Outside Nineveh, other sites complicate the picture. Nippur, a major religious and scribal center, yielded large collections of Sumerian and Akkadian tablets, many excavated by teams in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sippar produced vast archives, including temple records and scholarly texts. Ur and Uruk contributed their own bodies of material. Each site has its own history of excavation, export, and publication, and each contributes to a broader truth. There is no single Akkadian tablet record. There are multiple records, fractured by geography and by the politics of modern archaeology. The modern institutions that hold these tablets are also part of the story. Collections in London, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, Philadelphia, New Haven, and elsewhere hold overlapping and sometimes complementary fragments. Some have been photographed and published in major editions. Others remain in storage, waiting for conservation or specialist attention. Scholarly publishing is slow, and the number of tablets is enormous. Even without any intention to conceal, the effect can resemble concealment. Knowledge locked behind expertise, behind permissions, behind time. This is where the motif of restricted corridors becomes literal. The sealed spaces are not only ancient rooms, but modern storerooms. A visitor might see a handful of famous tablets under glass and assume that the rest has been read. In reality, the backlog is part of the field's everyday reality. Some texts are difficult, damaged, written in rare sign forms, or composed in specialized vocabulary. Some are less attractive to translators because they are repetitive, or because they lack obvious literary value. Yet those unattractive texts often contain the cultural assumptions that myths rely on. When they remain unpublished, a certain kind of context remains dim. The danger, in this environment, is that modern interpreters fill dimness with certainty. The phrase, genetic mistake, thrives in dimness. It suggests a missing line, a suppressed explanation, a deliberate removal. But the record offers more ordinary explanations first. A tablet can go missing because it was never excavated. It can be missing because it sits unread in a drawer. It can be missing because the relevant pieces are divided across collections and have not been joined. It can be missing because the text was never copied into the particular school tradition that survived into the archives that burned and baked. And there is another layer. The ancient scribes were not neutral copy machines. Scribal education relied on copying standard texts, and those texts formed a canon. Canon is selection. If certain traditions existed outside the canonical stream, they could vanish without anyone needing to erase them. Even within canon, a scribe might adapt lines to local theology or court preference. The differences can be small. One divine name substituted for another, one epithet shifted, one ritual term clarified. But small differences, repeated over centuries, can change the flavor of a story. The modern reader searching for a single, stable, original is often looking for something that never existed. This matters because the idea of a mistake implies a baseline design. It suggests a planned blueprint that went wrong. The surviving literature does not present creation that way. It presents creation as negotiation, as politics, as ritual solution. Atrahasis begins with labor conflict. Enuma Elish begins with divine conflict. In both, human making is embedded in a larger struggle to stabilize authority. If the result needed adjustment, that adjustment would not necessarily be described as error. It could be described as decree, as fate, as enforcement of boundaries after the fact. Even the language of fear requires caution. The gods in these texts are not portrayed as omniscient in every sense, but neither are they portrayed as helpless before humans. Their anxiety, when it appears, is often the anxiety of rulers about disorder, noise, excess, rebellion, neglect of ritual obligations. It is the anxiety of a system that must be maintained. If humans contain divine elements, the problem is not that humans become stronger than gods. The problem is that humans become unpredictable within a world that depends on predictable hierarchy. And yet, the archive leaves room for unease, not because it hides a clean confession, but because the most consequential passages are often preserved in multiple, slightly different versions, and because the differences cluster around the points that matter most. The ingredients of humanity, the motives for catastrophe, the mechanisms of control. A line broken at the wrong place can turn blood into life. A missing fragment can remove the name of the slain figure whose substance is mixed with clay. The narrative then becomes both firm and uncertain at once, firm in its outline, uncertain in its most intimate details. This is the corridor where the investigation continues. The question is no longer whether the tablets contain modern genetics. The question is how a culture described essence and inheritance, and how those descriptions can be misheard by later ears. To approach that, it becomes necessary to stand closer to the language itself, not to translate it into DNA, but to listen for what Akkadian scribes meant when they spoke of seed, of blood, of breath, and of the strange idea that a created being might carry within it the substance of a killed god. The next trace lies not in a sensational missing tablet, but in the precise words that survive on the ones that are already known, words that hover between body and destiny, between matter and decree, and that make the modern mind reach too quickly for the vocabulary of genes. In the scholarly editions, the Atrahasis Epic does not appear as a single clean manuscript. It appears as a family of witnesses, old Babylonian fragments, later copies, parallel lines preserved in school tablets, and echoes in other compositions. This is the first discipline the clay imposes. The story exists, but it exists in plural. Even its most famous passages arrive through reconstruction and comparison, and in places where the breaks cluster, certainty becomes a careful posture rather than a triumph. Still, certain movements remain recognizable across the tradition. The lesser gods labor. They dig canals and carry the heavy baskets of the earth. Their resentment builds until it becomes rebellion. The higher gods, figures like Enlil and others, depending on version and translation, must respond. A decision forms. The burden will be shifted. A new being will be made to work in their place. At that moment, the text turns toward ingredients. The oldest stories in this region often treat creation as craft. The world is shaped, not conjured. Humans are molded, not simply willed into being. Clay is the natural substance for such an act, because clay is everywhere in the river plains. and because clay can hold form. In Atrahasis, the maker figure, often associated with a goddess of birth and shaping, rendered in translations as Mami, Nintu, or related names, works with clay under a decree from the divine assembly. But the clay is mixed with something else, and that something else is where modern readers begin to lean forward. Many translations describe the slaying of a divine figure whose substance becomes part of humanity. The name and identity of that figure vary across traditions and scholarly reconstructions. In some tellings and later parallels, it is a god associated with intelligence or counsel. In others, the emphasis falls less on the personality of the slain figure and more on the act itself. A living divine element is sacrificed so that humans will carry life or spirit or a kind of animating force that clay alone cannot supply. Scholars debate the relationship between different versions of this motif, including its appearance in later texts like Enuma Elish, where a divine rebel is killed and humans are fashioned from his blood. The repetition suggests a shared conceptual architecture, even if the details shift. For the modern imagination, blood mixed with clay becomes a temptation. Blood is inheritance. Blood is lineage. Blood is a carrier of traits. In older idioms, blood is also identity, covenant, guilt, and vitality. The Akkadian vocabulary around blood and life does not map neatly onto modern biology, but it does insist that what flows inside a being matters. It is not merely symbolic, it is substance with consequence. The Atrahasis tradition does not present this mixture as an accident. It is a deliberate recipe, but deliberate recipes can still produce unintended outcomes, and the epic's next movement is precisely about outcome. The newly made humans multiply. Their noise rises. The complaint is not abstract, it is intimate. The gods cannot sleep. That detail has always bothered modern readers, because it renders the divine in a human posture, irritated, exhausted, disturbed by the city's clamor. Some scholars interpret it as a mythic expression of the tension between civilization and the forces that sustain it. Humans build cities and temples, but their collective presence becomes a kind of environmental pressure. In the epic's logic, the divine realm is not infinitely elastic. Too many humans produce too much disturbance. Whether that noise is literal sound or a metaphor for disruption, the effect is the same. A boundary has been crossed without any clear moral crime being named. Existence itself becomes a problem. Here, the word mistake begins to hover, not as a translation, but as an inference. If humans were created to relieve labor, why did their existence become intolerable? The epic offers one answer: the creators misjudged scale. They solved a work problem by creating a reproducing labor force. Reproducing labor forces do not stay at the number initially desired. They grow. Growth becomes pressure, pressure becomes complaint. The divine response unfolds in phases. In some versions, drought and famine are sent first. In others, disease follows. The epic's tone, as it survives, can be chillingly procedural. The gods convene. The decision is made. The effect is implemented. A hero figure, Atrahasis himself, receives warnings or instructions through dreams or divine speech, depending on the text. Ritual interventions appear. The human community responds. The cycle repeats. Each time the human population is reduced, it rebounds. Each time the complaint returns, it intensifies. The pattern resembles administration more than panic. It is not a scene of gods trembling before humans. It is the scene of gods managing an asset that keeps exceeding the limits of its role. If fear is present, it is the fear of losing control of a system. It is the fear of a city that will not remain quiet enough for the palace to sleep. The flood is the most famous intervention. In Atrahasis and related traditions, the decision to unleash a great flood becomes the final solution after lesser measures fail. The flood story's relationship to later biblical traditions has been debated for generations, and scholars carefully trace the transmission of motifs and the differences in theology and detail. But within the Mesopotamian corpus itself, the flood functions as a total reset. an attempt to erase the human excess in one sweeping motion. Yet even here, the epic does not close the problem. Humans survive. The gods regret, argue, or recalibrate. A new policy emerges. Rather than destroy humanity outright, limit it. This is the moment where the title's idea, why they feared us, seems closest to the surface. After the flood, the gods implement measures that prevent humans from multiplying uncontrollably. Different translations and reconstructions emphasize different mechanisms. Shortened lifespans, the introduction of stillbirth and infertility, and the establishment of social roles that reduce reproduction. The point is not that the gods erase the divine element in human makeup. It is that they enforce constraints around it. The human creature remains what it was, but its expansion is throttled. From a modern angle, it is easy to romanticize this as genetic containment, but the text does not need that reading. It presents a world where divine decree can alter conditions without altering molecules. In that world, to set mortality is to write a law into reality. To set infertility is to impose a boundary like a city wall. It is still a kind of control, but it is not modern biotechnology. It is cosmic governance. What remains strange, even after caution is applied, is how consistently the narrative returns to the same unease. Humans contain something divine, and the divine realm later acts as if that something must be managed. The epic does not say the mixture was wrong. It acts as if the mixture created a creature that cannot be left unattended. And in that gap between recipe and regulation, the imagination keeps seeing a shadow. If the mixture was deliberate, why the need for so much containment? If humans were meant to work, why the insistence on limiting their lives? If the creators were wise, why do they sound surprised by the consequences? The record does not answer in a single line. It offers a sequence of adjustments that suggest a system learning its own limits. The mistake, if that word belongs anywhere near the clay, may not be a flaw in the substance of humans, but a flaw in the planner's assumptions about what a created worker becomes once it can dream, speak, multiply, and fill the world with sound. The next step is to listen more closely to the words the texts use when they talk about the human ingredient that is not clay, because the nature of that ingredient determines whether the story is about labor, about spirit, about guilt, or about something that looks like inheritance. The tablets keep repeating the same substance: blood, life, breath, name. The meaning changes depending on which one is foregrounded. And somewhere in those shifting foregrounds, the record grows thin again, right where modern curiosity becomes most hungry. The corridor narrows at the point where translation becomes temptation. In Akkadian, and in the older Sumerian layers that feed into it, the words that describe what humans are made from are not technical terms. They are thick words, heavy with ritual, law, and social meaning. They can be rendered into English in more than one way without anyone being dishonest. The problem is that each rendering carries a different shadow. Blood, for example, can be read as biological substance, but also as lineage, guilt, vitality, and the bond that ties a person to an origin. Seed can be read as reproductive matter, but also as posterity, descent, the future contained in a present act. Breath can be read as air and life, but also as spirit, speech, the animating force that makes a body more than clay. Name can be read as label, but also as destiny, identity, authority, and the power to be called into place in the cosmic order. In a world where these words do not separate into biology on one side and metaphor on the other, modern readers can easily mishear. The temptation is to treat the ancient vocabulary as if it were an early, disguised form of modern science. It is more accurate to treat it as a different map of reality altogether, where substance and decree overlap and where the boundary between body and fate is porous. This is why the same creation motif can appear with shifting emphasis across the centuries. A scribal tradition might highlight the blood of the slain divine figure, because that detail underlines a theological point. Humans are bonded to divine authority through a sacrificial act. Another tradition might highlight breath because it supports a ritual and philosophical point. Life is a gift and a loan from the divine realm. Another might highlight clay because it keeps human status humble and bounded. Humans are earth, shaped temporarily, destined to return. Copying itself becomes the mechanism of these shifts. Mesopotamian scribes trained by reproducing texts. They learned sign forms, grammar, and cultural knowledge through repetition. In the process, they also carried forward what their schools valued. Sometimes copying was conservative, aimed at preserving an authoritative line. Sometimes copying included minor adaptation, substituting a divine name that fit local theology, or clarifying a phrase for a new audience, or smoothing a passage whose meaning had become obscure. Over time, those small adjustments could accumulate into variant traditions. In the modern editions, this appears as parallel lines that do not quite match. A passage preserved in one old Babylonian fragment may differ from a later standard version. A bilingual tablet may give a Sumerian line and an Akkadian equivalent that is more interpretation than literal translation. The differences are not always dramatic, but they often cluster around the places that modern readers care about most: the ingredients, the divine actors, the reasons for catastrophe, the mechanics of limitation. This is one reason the idea of a missing genetic explanation is so seductive. If variants exist, then perhaps one version once contained a stronger statement that was later softened. Perhaps a line naming the divine ingredient more precisely was altered into a generic phrase. Perhaps a ritual term that implied a particular process was replaced by a more familiar formula. These are possibilities in the abstract, and scholars do sometimes discuss how standardization can reduce local diversity. But possibility is not proof. The evidence usually does not allow that kind of confident reconstruction. More often, the record suggests something simpler. The ancient writers did not care to specify the way a modern reader wants. Their narratives were not designed to satisfy curiosity about mechanism. They were designed to explain roles and limits. The creation scene is a hinge that turns the cosmos into a social order: gods above, humans below, labor assigned, death imposed. The mixture matters because it anchors that order. It explains why humans can serve, and why they are nevertheless not divine equals. The anxiety about humans then follows naturally. If humans have a divine component, they also have the potential to behave in ways that threaten the established hierarchy, not because they can overthrow the gods by force, but because they can neglect ritual, forget obligations, multiply beyond control, and create disturbances that ripple through the system. The god's response becomes a restoration of hierarchy, not a response to a biological mutation. Yet the texts themselves allow another shade of unease. The divine element in humans is often linked to a slain being, and slain beings carry guilt. In some readings of Mesopotamian sacrificial logic, the act of killing to create implies that human life is founded on violence within the divine realm. That violence can be understood as a stain. In that frame, humanity's essence is not merely divine, it is divine through transgression. The creature is animated by something that had to be cut out of the divine community. If that is the case, the later need for containment feels less like fear of strength and more like fear of contamination. A being created from blood linked to rebellion or sacrifice may carry a tendency toward disorder, not as genetics, but as fate. It may carry a story inside its substance. The gods would then be managing not a mistake in a laboratory sense, but a moral consequence embedded in creation. This possibility is not stated in a simple sentence on the tablets. It is a reading that emerges when motifs are placed side by side: the killing, the mixing, the noise, the flood, the controls. Some researchers might suggest that Mesopotamian myth is preoccupied with the idea that order must be purchased through violence and maintained through constraint. Others might dispute that emphasis and argue that the mythic logic is primarily political and functional. Humans exist to work, limits exist to prevent chaos. Both readings can coexist because the texts are multi-layered and because they were used in different settings: schoolrooms, temples, scholarly circles. The modern phrase genetic mistake flattens all of this into a single shiny object. It suggests one wrong letter in a code. The ancient materials suggest something broader and darker. The wrongness, if it exists, is woven into the structure of a world where beings are created to serve and then restrained when they become too alive. At this point, the investigation must widen. It cannot remain inside Atrahasis alone. The creation motif appears elsewhere, reshaped for new purposes. Enuma Elish, composed in Babylonian tradition and used in ceremonial contexts, frames creation within a story of divine kingship and cosmic order. Its famous lines about forming humanity from the blood of a killed rebel god echo Atrahasis in a different key. The emphasis shifts toward legitimacy. Why the gods rule, why the city's patron deity is supreme, why humans exist as laborers supporting divine worship. In that setting, the idea of a mistake would not be articulated as a flaw. It would be articulated as a threat to authority, and authority does not admit flaws easily. It frames its interventions as decrees, not corrections. If humans must be limited, the narrative will present limitation as rightful governance. And yet the same shadow returns. A killed divine figure becomes an ingredient. Humans inherit something from that death. The resulting creature becomes noisy, restless, and difficult to keep within bounds. The pattern repeats across compositions that were copied for centuries. That repetition is not proof of hidden genetics, but it is evidence of a persistent cultural unease, a sense that humanity's origin contains a dangerous surplus, and that the world has been managing that surplus ever since. The next trace will follow the creation story into Enuma Elish, where political theology hardens the narrative into ceremony, and where the making of humans becomes not merely a solution, but a declaration of hierarchy. In that declaration, the places where the text is confident will matter, but so will the places where it grows ceremonial, formulaic, and strangely uninterested in detail, as if the mechanism was never the point and the silence itself was part of the spell. When Enuma Elish is approached as a text rather than an echo, its first impression is not secrecy but grandeur. It was not merely copied to be read in private, it was tied to ritual and to the public life of Babylonian power. Scholars have long associated it with the New Year festival in Babylon, where the reaffirmation of divine kingship and cosmic order mattered as much as the story itself. The epic's tone is ceremonial. Its universe is a hierarchy that has been fought for and secured. That context changes the feeling of creation. In Atrahasis, human making begins in labor conflict among the gods, with an almost domestic irritation at work and noise. In Enuma Elish, human making comes after a cosmic war. The victory of Marduk over Tiamat is not simply a mythic battle. It is a statement about authority, about which God rules, about why Babylon stands where it stands in the sacred geography of the world. The epic is a political theology written on clay. Sustaining the temples and rituals can be sustaining the temples, and rituals can be placed on a created workforce. The language is often more declarative than exploratory. It is not interested in anatomy, it is interested in arrangement. And yet, in the middle of that arrangement, the motif of blood returns. A rebel figure is selected for execution, often rendered in translations as Kingu, and from his blood humanity is created. The narrative, as preserved, presents this as a solution that also carries judgment. The rebel's death is not merely a practical ingredient, it is the punishment that becomes the foundation of a new order. Humanity, in this telling, is born from the blood of condemned rebellion. The temptation to read this as genetics is immediate for a modern mind. Blood is treated as information in contemporary culture as much as it is treated as tissue, bloodlines, inherited traits, coded ancestry. But Enuma Elish does not offer that modern concept. It offers something closer to jurisprudence. Blood is guilt. Blood is responsibility. Blood is the substance by which the consequences of rebellion are transferred into a lower realm. Humans become the carriers of a crime they did not commit, created so that the divine realm's stability will not require the gods themselves to bear the daily weight. To support the gods' rest, and the rituals to support the gods' rest, and the rituals that maintain cosmic stability. If humans are later limited, the limitation fits the same logic. A workforce that grows too loud or too numerous threatens the very rest it was created to secure. Fear in this context does not need to be emotional. It can be institutional. The divine realm's anxiety is embedded in its architecture. If the hierarchy slips, chaos returns. In Enuma Elish, chaos is not a metaphor. It is personified as Tiamat and the primordial sea. The epic remembers that order is fragile because it had to be won by force. Anything that hints at rebellion, noise, or uncontrolled multiplication becomes a reminder of the pre-order world. Still, the question persists. Where does the modern phrase genetic mistake find its strongest foothold, if not in literal biology? It finds it in the unsettling continuity between rebellion and humanity. If humans are made from the blood of a condemned figure, then humans are linked to disorder at the level of origin. They are not only a workforce, they are a repository. They hold a trace of what the gods had to kill in order to rule. The epic does not say that humans will rebel because of this. It does not claim that a trait is inherited as biology, yet the narrative structure suggests an unease. The thing that threatened divine unity becomes the substance of the beings who now crowd the world below. Some scholars might treat this as mythic logic rather than psychological dread. In mythic logic, a new order is stabilized by transforming the defeated threat into a useful component. The enemy becomes building material. The defeated sea becomes the sky and earth. The rebel's blood becomes humanity. In that reading, humanity is not feared. It is repurposed chaos, domesticated and put to work. The mistake would then be a modern projection, an anxious interpretation laid onto an older confidence that order can harness what it defeats. Others might point out that domestication is never complete. A threat transformed into foundation still remains a threat in memory. The epic may be confident in its hierarchy, but it is also haunted by the fact that hierarchy required killing. The god's rest is purchased. The cost does not vanish. It becomes part of the world's design. From there, the question of missing records takes on a different color. If Enuma Elish and Atrahasis both preserve a tradition in which humanity contains a trace of a killed divine figure, then the absence of a mechanistic explanation may be intentional in a cultural sense. Not because scribes hid science, but because the power of the narrative lies in its ritual clarity, not in its details. Ceremony does not want messy explanation. Ceremony wants a clean decree. The festival recitation does not invite debate about process. It enacts order through repetition. That does not mean every detail is fixed. Textual scholarship shows that even Enuma Elish exists in variant forms and that scribal traditions could differ, but its core function as an ideological anchor would have encouraged stability and standardization. In such a stream, any version that drew attention away from hierarchy and toward mechanism might simply have been less attractive to copy. The modern mind interprets that as suppression. The ancient mind might have interpreted it as propriety. Certain things are not said because saying them does not serve the ritual goal. Some knowledge remains in the workshop rather than the temple court. Some explanations remain practical rather than cosmological. This is where the idea of sealed spaces becomes more than metaphor. Mesopotamian scholarship itself was compartmentalized. There were temple scholars, omen experts, exorcists, scribal teachers. There were texts for public recitation and texts for specialized training. There were compositions that were copied widely and others that were guarded by difficulty. The missing could be a matter of genre. A creation epic would not read like a technical manual, even if technical knowledge existed elsewhere. If a culture wanted to talk about the body in detail, it had other ways. It wrote medical and diagnostic texts. It wrote omen series that mapped organs and symptoms. It wrote rituals that treated illness as a force moving through space. Those corpora often feel closer to systems than the epics do. They are catalogs, sequences, conditional statements. They resemble an attempt to describe reality with rules. It is in those technical corpora, not in the epics, that the modern reader might be most tempted to see something like genetic thinking, because they contain observations about birth anomalies, inherited patterns, and bodily signs that recur. But even there, the interpretive frame is not molecular. It is divinatory and ritual. The body is a text written by fate, not a machine written by genes. Enuma Elish, then, provides not a hidden genetic confession, but a hardened justification for hierarchy. Humans are made from the blood of a condemned figure, placed into service, and expected to maintain the conditions of divine rest. If humans later become noisy, restless, or unmanageable, the response is not surprise at a mutation. It is enforcement of order. Yet something in that enforcement remains uneasy. The epic's confidence about divine kingship sits beside the uncomfortable truth that humans are made from the residue of rebellion. Even when transformed into labor, the origin carries an echo. A being formed from that blood might not be trusted to remain quiet forever. The fear, if it exists, is not fear of superior power. It is fear of recurrence, fear that the old chaos will find a new voice. The next trace moves away from epic and ceremony and into a colder literature, the omen texts and diagnostic series where bodies are read like maps. There, the record becomes both more detailed and more alien, and the temptation to translate sign into code becomes almost irresistible. In the epics, creation is narrated as drama. In the scholarly omen texts, reality is narrated as conditional logic. If this mark appears, then that outcome follows. If a child is born with a particular feature, then a certain fate threatens. If an organ shows an unusual shape, then the king's reign is in danger, or the city will suffer, or an enemy will advance. The voice is less emotional, more procedural. The world is treated as readable. This is where the modern imagination can make a mistake of its own. A system of signs can look like a system of codes. A catalog of bodily anomalies can look like early genetics. But the Omen series do not propose that a trait arises from heredity in a chemical sense. They propose that a trait is a message, an inscription by divine will or cosmic order. The body becomes a page where the future is written. The meaning is not inside the body as mechanism. The meaning is imposed upon the body as signal. The Mesopotamian divinatory tradition was immense. Scholars reconstruct large omen series, such as those dealing with celestial phenomena, liver divination, birth anomalies, and everyday occurrences. These texts were studied by specialists attached to courts and temples. The knowledge was practical in its own way. It guided decisions, justified actions, and framed political events within a sacred logic. It was also conservative. Omen series were copied over centuries, standardized, and expanded. The resulting corpora are some of the most systematic bodies of writing from the ancient world. Within these texts, the human body appears as a landscape of anomalies. A child born with an extra limb, unusual proportions, or other features becomes an omen. The text does not ask why the anomaly occurred in biological terms. It asks what it means for the king, the household, or the land. The anomaly is not a mistake in the body's construction. It is a disturbance in the relationship between the human realm and the divine realm. Yet even within this framework, certain patterns stand out. The omen texts often treat anomalies as breaches of boundary. The body is expected to follow a stable form. When it does not, the event is treated as a crack in order itself. The concern is not pity for the child. The concern is the ripple effect. What does this deviation announce? To a modern reader, the focus can feel cruel, but it is also revealing. It suggests that Mesopotamian thinkers experienced the human form as a rule that could be broken, and that such breaks carried cosmic significance. That is close enough to error language that modern interpreters might be tempted to draw a straight line to genetics. But the line bends. The omen texts are not trying to locate causality inside the body. They are trying to locate meaning in the event. This difference matters for the larger question of why they feared us. In omen literature, fear is often fear of signs. It is fear that the gods are speaking in ways that indicate anger, withdrawal, or impending disaster. A body anomaly is frightening not because it reveals a superior human potential, but because it suggests divine displeasure or cosmic instability. The fear is directed upward and outward, not downward toward humans as rivals. And yet, the body becomes a site of anxiety precisely because it is human. If humans contain a trace of divine substance, As the creation myths suggest, then the body is not merely clay. It is an interface. It can register disturbances. It can bear messages. It can become the point where the divine realm touches the human realm in visible form. That idea does not need modern genetics to feel unsettling. It makes every birth a potential omen and every illness a potential sign that the boundary between worlds is shifting. The diagnostic texts associated with illness move in a similar direction. They catalog symptoms and prognoses, often with an eye toward both practical treatment and ritual response. The body is again read as a field where forces act. Some illnesses are attributed to specific divine or demonic agencies, to breaking taboos, to the hand of a god. The hand is not literal. It is a way of saying the sickness is not random. It is an event with meaning. Here, too, modern readers sometimes reach for biology. They see repeated symptom clusters and wonder about inherited disease. They see references to family and lineage and imagine genetics hiding under the surface. In some cases, it is plausible that ancient observers noticed that certain conditions ran in families, just as anyone might notice across generations. But the texts do not explain those patterns through inheritance as chemistry. They explain them through fate, divine will, and the moral or ritual status of a household. This is the first moment in the investigation where the phrase genetic mistake can be reinterpreted in a way that actually fits the ancient mental world. The mistake might not be a mutation, it might be a breach. A household breaks an obligation. The body bears the consequence. A community becomes too noisy. Catastrophe bears down. The error is relational, not molecular. It is an error in the way humans stand within the cosmic hierarchy. From that perspective, the fear becomes coherent. The gods are not depicted as fearing human power in a scientific sense. They are depicted as reacting to human behavior that threatens the stability of order. Humans are noisy. Humans multiply. Humans forget. Humans cross lines. The divine realm responds with signs and constraints. The omen texts, in their cold cataloging, reveal how pervasive that logic was. The world is full of warnings. Everything can be read as a sign that boundaries are being tested. Still, the modern question persists because the ancient record has its own kind of silence. The Omen series preserve thousands of conditional statements, but they often do not preserve the reasoning behind them. Why does this anomaly mean that? Why does that sign point to this fate? The texts rarely explain. They list. They accumulate. They treat the correspondence as inherited authority. That absence of explanation is another gap that shouldn't exist. And it is exactly the kind of gap that invites modern projection. If the meaning is not explained, perhaps the explanation was technical, and perhaps it was lost. Perhaps scribes once had a deeper model, or perhaps the model was never articulated because it was not needed. In a divinatory culture, authority can be created through tradition alone. A sign means what the series says it means because the series is the series. The investigation must remain careful here. It is easy to turn the silence of explanation into a hidden science narrative. But a more grounded reading is that the omen texts represent a different epistemology. Knowledge as correspondence rather than mechanism. The world speaks through patterns. The task of the scholar is to memorize and apply them, not to dismantle them into causes. Yet even that grounded reading does not remove the unease. The omen corpus treats anomalies in humans and in animals as messages about the state of the realm. The body becomes political. Birth becomes prophecy. A deviation becomes a warning. In that environment, the human form is not safe from interpretation. It is always being watched by the logic of signs. If a culture believes that humans are mixed from divine blood and clay, and that their bodies can broadcast signs about cosmic stability, then the fear around humans does not need genetics to take shape. Humans are not merely workers, they are indicators. They are pressure points in the divine-human relationship. A surge in human numbers and noise can trigger catastrophe. A strange birth can signal political upheaval. A disease can announce divine anger. The next trace leads deeper into that pressure point. Not the anomaly as omen, but the anomaly as something that forces the culture to confront the fragility of its categories. male and female, human and animal, living and dead. In the places where categories blur, the record becomes most anxious, and the language of mistake becomes most tempting, even if it never becomes literal. Some of the most unsettling lines in Mesopotamian omen literature are not about storms or eclipses, but about births that disturb the idea of what a human is supposed to be. The texts often classify unusual births with the same calm precision used for clouds and liver marks. Calm does not mean indifference. Calm can be a mask for dread. In a world where order is believed to be maintained by correct boundaries, a body that blurs boundaries becomes a kind of question that cannot be answered quickly. These records are difficult to approach without modern assumptions. The modern mind wants to categorize these descriptions as medical conditions, congenital anomalies, genetic syndromes, complications of pregnancy, infection, malnutrition, chance. Those explanations can be plausible, and in many cases, they are the most reasonable. But the ancient texts are not attempting diagnosis in that sense. They are attempting interpretation. The body is treated as a symbol event. In those symbolic events, certain themes recur. When features double, when limbs appear where they should not, when sex characteristics are ambiguous or appear mixed, the omen often points toward instability, conflict, upheaval, disruption of succession, uncertainty in the land. The logic seems to be that a body that does not conform to expected form mirrors a world that will not conform to expected order. The birth becomes an image of a future political fracture. If the modern phrase genetic mistake is placed here, it fits only as a translation of modern discomfort. The ancient discomfort is not about gene copying errors. It is about the cosmos sending a sign that categories are breaking down. The fear is fear of the sign, fear of what it implies, fear that the gods are warning that the boundary between stability and chaos is thinning. This is not the same fear described in Atrahasis. Atrahasis fears human noise and multiplication. Omen literature fears deviation as message. But the two fears can meet. Both assume that humans are not neutral. Humans are part of the mechanism of cosmic order. When humans multiply too much, the cosmos reacts. When humans are born in unsettling forms, the cosmos speaks. In both, humanity becomes a site of pressure. The pressure becomes heavier when these texts are placed beside ritual literature. In Mesopotamia, certain specialists, often translated as exorcists, incantation priests, ritual experts, worked with texts intended to repel evil, cure illness, purify spaces, and manage what was perceived as contamination. The language is again different from modern science. Evil can be personified, illness can be treated as an invading force, and misfortune can be treated as a presence that clings to the body or the house. The rituals often focus on boundaries, thresholds, doorways, corners, beds, wells. The house becomes a map of vulnerable points. In such a world, mistake is not just inside flesh. It can be in a ritual sequence performed incorrectly. It can be in a taboo broken unknowingly. It can be in a curse attached to a lineage. It can be in the residue of a dead person that was not handled properly. The causes are moral, social, and spiritual as much as they are bodily. This does not mean Mesopotamian thinkers were ignorant of physical causes. They observed, they treated, they experimented with remedies. But their conceptual frame allowed multiple causes to operate at once. A fever could be treated with herbs and also with incantations. A difficult birth could be managed with practical assistance and also interpreted as a sign. The world was layered, and the layers did not cancel each other. For the investigation, this layering becomes important because it offers an alternative explanation for the modern hunger for hidden genetics. The hunger arises partly from the sense that the ancient record is too confident in invisible forces. Modern readers want a mechanism that feels tangible, but the ancient texts already provide tangible mechanisms, ritual mechanisms, social mechanisms, administrative mechanisms. They do not seek to isolate a single causal layer the way modern science does. The fear of humans can then be reframed as fear of permeability. Humans are porous. They can be polluted. They can be possessed. They can transmit misfortune. Their bodies can display omens. Their voices can disturb the gods. Their numbers can overwhelm the balance. In every case, humans are not simply created and left alone. They require management, purification, limitation. This management is not hidden. It is one of the most visible features of Mesopotamian religion and scholarship. The question becomes, why is management so central? One answer is that the culture experienced life as precarious, subject to droughts, floods, disease, war, and political instability. In such conditions, a worldview that reads everything as sign and contamination offers a kind of control. Another answer is that the worldview served political authority because it linked stability to ritual correctness and obedience. Both can be true at once. Neither requires a literal genetic origin story. And yet, the record keeps producing small shocks, moments where the language almost invites a biological reading. Seed is one of those words. In Akkadian, words related to seed and offspring appear in legal texts about inheritance and in descriptions of lineage. They can also appear in ritual contexts where seed is associated with potency, continuity, and the future of a household. A curse can be described as cutting off seed. A blessing can be described as multiplying it. These are social realities mapped into a physical metaphor, but because the metaphor is bodily, it can be mistaken for proto-genetics. Bone and flesh are similar. They can be literal body parts, but they also serve as synekdoche for kinship and identity. To say someone is of one's bone is to say something about belonging. When creation myths speak of shaping flesh from clay and animating it with blood or breath, the modern mind hears the language of construction. The ancient mind hears the language of ritual making and social placement. This is why the investigation cannot accept the modern term genetic mistake without changing it into something the sources can actually support. If there is a mistake motif in the record, it will look like a breach of boundary or a miscalculation of governance. It will look like noise that becomes intolerable. It will look like uncontrolled multiplication that requires mortality as restraint. It will look like a created being carrying within it the residue of rebellion. It will look like a world that must constantly purify itself against contamination. At this stage, another question rises, quietly but insistently. If the Mesopotamian tradition saw humans as porous and potentially destabilizing, why did it also invest so heavily in the idea that humans must serve the gods through ritual and labor? Why create a being that must constantly be managed? Why not create something simpler, something quieter, something less capable of disruption? The epics answer that question indirectly. The gods themselves wanted rest and order. A being capable of work and ritual is more useful than a simpler creature. The omen and ritual texts answer it differently. Usefulness does not eliminate risk. In fact, usefulness can increase risk because the more integrated a being is into the system, the more it can destabilize the system when it deviates. The next trace therefore returns to a human figure who embodies integration and deviation at once. The king, especially the king who reaches too far. In the literature, the king is the human closest to divine power, the human most likely to disturb boundaries, and the human whose body and fate are watched with the greatest anxiety. In that attention, the fear of humans becomes sharper, because it is concentrated on the one human who might actually behave like a god. In Mesopotamian political theology, the king stands in a charged space between realms. He is human, but his office is saturated with divine legitimacy. He is expected to build temples, maintain canals, and keep order. He is also expected to read signs, consult scholars, and respond correctly to omens that threaten the land. The king, more than anyone else, lives under the gaze of the omen tradition. His body, his dreams, his health, and the timing of his actions are treated as points where the cosmos can speak. This focus intensifies the broader anxiety about human boundaries. If ordinary humans are noisy and numerous, the king is singular and powerful. If ordinary births can be omens, The royal succession becomes an omen in motion. If the gods must manage humanity, they must especially manage the human who represents humanity's highest reach. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not a royal inscription and not a court omen text, but it circles the king's boundary with unusual psychological clarity. Gilgamesh is described as exceptional, partly divine, immensely strong, restless, consuming. He builds and conquers, but he also violates. The early movement of the epic shows a king who treats his power as entitlement. The gods respond not by erasing him, but by creating a counterweight, Enkidu. Their conflict, friendship, and subsequent loss become the mechanism by which the king is reshaped. To modern eyes, this is moral drama. To the investigation, it is also boundary enforcement. Gilgamesh is the human who behaves as if limits do not apply. The epic's answer to him is not a new law written on stone, but an experience written into his body. Grief, exhaustion, the long road to the end of hope. When he seeks immortality, he is not punished with lightning. He is permitted to walk to the edge and discover the door is closed. Here, fear appears again, but it is a contained fear. The gods do not fear Gilgamesh's strength. They fear the precedent of a human refusing the human condition. They fear the boundary becoming negotiable. If one king could seize immortality, the order of the world would be rewritten. The epic, therefore, stages a lesson. Even the most extraordinary cannot take what is not allotted. The story's most haunting symbol is the plant of rejuvenation, gained with effort and then lost to a snake while Gilgamesh rests. The loss is not a conspiracy. It is the casual cruelty of a world where mortality can slip back into place the moment vigilance softens. The message is not shouted. It is absorbed. The human can reach, but not hold. The boundary is not enforced by force alone. It is enforced by the world's texture, by the way gifts vanish, by the way sleep creates vulnerability. This texture resembles the Atrahasis complaint in an unexpected way. In Atrahasis, the gods cannot sleep because humans are too loud. In Gilgamesh, sleep becomes the moment where immortality is lost. Sleep, in both, is a hinge. The divine realm demands it. The human realm is undone by it. The motif suggests that the struggle is not merely about power, but about the conditions of consciousness itself. A being that sleeps is a being that can be managed. A being that does not sleep, or that disturbs sleep, becomes a problem. The king's role also connects to the technical corpora. Omen texts often focus on the king because political stability depends on him. Certain signs are interpreted as warnings about his reign. Ritual responses exist to avert disaster. In some cases, substitution rituals, where a substitute king is installed temporarily to absorb a predicted doom, appear in the scholarly and historical record. These practices, where tested, show a court taking signs seriously enough to enact elaborate protective measures. The measures are again a form of management, not of genetics, but of fate. This emphasis on management supports a different reading of the genetic mistake obsession. The obsession assumes that the fear is inside human biology. The Mesopotamian materials suggest that the fear is inside human position. The fear emerges when a human is too close to divine prerogative, too loud, too numerous, too ambitious, too untethered to ritual obligation, too resistant to mortality. If humans contain a trace of divine blood, then kings contain a trace of divine authority, layered on top of that trace. They are double charged. That does not make them genetically different. It makes them socially and cosmically dangerous. The more a human is treated as divine adjacent, the more urgent it becomes to remind everyone that the human is still clay. In the wider record, this reminder takes many forms. Royal inscriptions often proclaim that a king is chosen by a god, beloved by a goddess, strengthened by divine power. Yet those same inscriptions also emphasize piety, building, correct ritual, and obedience. The king's legitimacy depends on submission. The ideology grants him greatness while insisting that greatness is conditional. That conditionality is a kind of fear management. It keeps the king inside a cage made of blessing language. The king is elevated, but the elevation is framed as gift, not entitlement. The moment entitlement appears, the narrative world of Gilgamesh stands ready as a warning. A great king can be undone by grief and time. The texts thus maintain hierarchy by allowing humans to be close to divinity, but not equal to it. At this point, the investigation can return to the flood motif with a sharper lens. The flood is not only an ecological catastrophe in myth, it is the ultimate boundary enforcement. It is the declaration that when noise and multiplication exceed the god's tolerance, the world can be reset. But the flood is also followed by policy changes, limitations on birth and lifespan. That sequence resembles the king's story. First, an extreme intervention, then, a structure of restraint to prevent recurrence. In other words, the Mesopotamian record repeatedly stages the same logic. Creation produces a being that is valuable, but the being's value creates risk. Risk requires containment. Containment must be renewed because it tends to fail. The mistake, if any, is not a slipped letter in a code. It is the design decision to create a being capable of excess. The next trace follows that excess in its most ordinary form. Not kings and heroes, but crowds. The texts do not only fear exceptional humans, they fear the mass. The word noise in Atrahasis becomes the clue. It points toward a deeper anxiety about density. Cities swelling, voices rising, rituals neglected, the gods' sleep disturbed. In that anxiety, fear becomes urban, and the genetic metaphor gives way to something older, the dread of a world that has become too full. The Atrahasis complaint about noise can be read as mythic exaggeration, but it also resonates with the physical reality of Mesopotamian life. The river plains could be fertile, but they were also fragile. Agriculture depended on canals that required constant maintenance. Cities depended on stored grain, on organized labor, on the cooperation of households and institutions that could fracture under pressure. In such a landscape, a growing population was both a triumph and a risk. More bodies meant more hands, more production, more offerings. It also meant more demand, more strain on water and grain, more potential for unrest. The myths fold that reality into divine irritation. Humans become too many, too loud, too present. The gods cannot sleep. If sleep is understood as the symbol of divine rest and stability, then the complaint is not trivial. It is an alarm. The world's arrangement is being disturbed by the very beings created to uphold it. That disturbance can be framed as mistake only if the design assumed quiet obedience. The record suggests that assumption did not hold. In the literary tradition, the solution is catastrophe and constraint. In the administrative tradition, the solution is organization, ration lists, labor assignments, records of work teams, laws about property, debts, and obligations. The Clay Archive shows how much effort went into managing human density. Even without explicit mythic language, the bureaucracy reveals the same anxiety. Crowds require control. Disorder is expensive. The city is a machine that must be fed with accurate numbers. This is where the investigative tone becomes particularly careful, because the temptation to force the modern narrative grows stronger. A modern audience hears, "They feared us," and imagines fear of human potential. The Mesopotamian record more often suggests fear of human unpredictability in aggregate. The crowd is not feared because it is brilliant. It is feared because it can overwhelm. The crowd also produces another kind of noise: legal noise, economic noise, the constant friction of disputes. Mesopotamian law collections, though different in nature and purpose from modern statutes, reflect a society concerned with boundaries and consequences. They regulate injury, property, marriage, inheritance, labor, and debt. These texts do not speak of divine blood, but they speak of the daily structures that keep people from tearing one another apart. In that sense, they are another set of controls, parallel to the mythic controls imposed by the gods. It is possible to see a consistent cultural logic here. Humans are created to bear burdens. The burden bearing produces civilization. Civilization produces density. Density produces conflict. Conflict threatens order. Order must be defended by law, ritual, omen consultation, and occasionally by violence. The gods in myth respond to density with catastrophe. Kings, in history, respond with walls, corvée labor, taxation, and military campaigns. Both responses reflect the same fear, the fear that human life, if left unchecked, becomes ungovernable. This kind of fear is not glamorous, and that is why it is often ignored in favor of more sensational interpretations. It does not sound like ancient engineering, it sounds like administration. Yet administration is what Mesopotamian writing was born to do. The very medium of cuneiform, pressed into clay, emerges from the need to manage surplus and obligation. If the culture's foundational tool is administration, then its foundational myths will naturally think in administrative terms. Labor, quotas, rest, complaint, reset, constraint. Even the divine assembly in Atrahasis behaves like a council managing policy. It debates, it implements measures, it reacts to results, it adjusts. The flood is the most extreme policy, but it is still framed as decision and implementation. The gods are not described as trembling, they are described as governing. Within this governing frame, the idea of a genetic mistake can be reinterpreted as a miscalculation of governance. A workforce that reproduces freely becomes a problem. A created creature that can organize, rebel, and refuse becomes a problem. A king who seeks immortality becomes a problem. A birth anomaly that signals instability becomes a problem. The common thread is not biology, it is excess beyond the assigned role. At the same time, the record contains another kind of silence that keeps the modern imagination unsettled, the silence around inner experience. The myths describe complaint and catastrophe, but they rarely dwell on the human interior as a modern novel would. They do not describe humans wrestling with identity as created beings. They do not describe a people discovering they carry divine blood. They describe humans as a category. They describe what happens to them. They describe what they owe. This absence makes it easier for modern interpreters to insert their own interior drama, fear, awakening, hidden potential, genetic awakening. But the ancient texts do not give that interior drama directly. They give a different drama, the drama of maintaining a fragile system. The motif of maps that change belongs here. Cities in Mesopotamian history rose and fell. Canals shifted. River courses moved. Political boundaries expanded and collapsed. The archive itself is scattered because the map changed repeatedly. Empires rising, temples rebuilt, libraries gathered and burned. The physical geography of the record is unstable. That instability can create the illusion of missing purpose. A tablet lost is not always lost because it was forbidden. It can be lost because the city that housed it was abandoned, or because a later builder reused the bricks, or because the site remains unexcavated. Yet some missing feels different. Some absences cluster around the most charged questions. How exactly humans were made, why the gods chose certain ingredients, what the slain divine figure represented, why the flood was chosen rather than another solution. It is possible that these absences are simply the result of the fragility of clay and the accidents of excavation. It is also possible that the culture itself kept certain details within specialized circles, never meant for broad recitation. Public myths can be deliberately sparse in their mechanics. Technical knowledge, if any existed, could be housed in different genres. The record does not decisively settle which is true. What can be said with more confidence is that Mesopotamian scholarship did value secrecy in a limited, institutional sense. Specialized knowledge was guarded by training, by initiation into a profession, by the difficulty of the texts themselves. Some colophons, scribal notes, indicate ownership, warning against unauthorized copying in certain cases, or identifying a tablet as belonging to a particular scholar or family tradition. This does not prove a hidden genetic narrative. It does show that knowledge could be controlled through social structures rather than through erasure. The modern phrase, restricted corridors, thus becomes literal again. There were corridors of expertise. There were doors that required education to open. Many of those doors remain hard to open today because Akkadian and Sumerian are specialized fields, because tablets remain unpublished, and because the corpus is vast. The result is a continuing asymmetry. A small number of people can read the material directly, while the broader culture receives it through translation and popular retellings. This asymmetry is fertile ground for sensational claims, but it is also fertile ground for a more disciplined mystery. Not the mystery of a secret genetic line, but the mystery of how a civilization encoded its anxieties into myths and then distributed those myths through institutions designed to maintain order. The next trace moves into the place where institutional caution looks most like silence, the modern journey of tablets through excavation, collection, cataloging, and publication. The investigation will follow the clay not only in antiquity, but in the last 2 centuries, where the story's gaps have been shaped by museums, archives, and the slow labor of scholarship. In those modern corridors, the line between missing and unread becomes thin enough to feel like a wall. The modern life of a cuneiform tablet often begins in broken light, a trench opened in heat, a wall exposed, a room emptied into baskets, clay fragments lifted out of packed earth and carried into the open air where their surfaces dry, flake, and sometimes crumble. The 19th century produced a surge of excavation in Mesopotamia, driven by a mixture of curiosity, imperial competition, biblical interest, and the hunger of museums to possess antiquity. The result was a vast movement of objects, from soil into ships, from ships into storerooms, from storerooms into catalogs. That movement created its own kind of silence. A tablet in a drawer is not absent, yet it is functionally invisible. A fragment without a join is not meaningless, yet it cannot speak its full sentence. A piece mislabeled or separated from its archaeological context loses a portion of its voice, because context is one of the few anchors that can limit speculation. In an archive where thousands of clay pieces lie in boxes, the record becomes less a book than a fog. Scholars have spent generations thinning that fog. They photograph, copy signs by hand, compare fragments, and publish editions that allow others to test readings. The work is slow because the material demands slowness. Some tablets are damaged or worn. Some are written in cramped sign forms. Some belong to technical series that require familiarity with specialized vocabulary. Some are routine administrative notes whose importance is not obvious until they are placed beside hundreds of similar notes. This slowness is not dramatic, but it has consequences for the kind of story modern audiences receive. Epics and famous myths are translated earlier and more often because they attract attention. Technical corpora and obscure ritual texts can take longer to enter public awareness. Even within epics, certain lines become famous and are repeatedly cited, while other lines remain debated, footnoted, or uncertain. A culture listening for genetic motifs will gravitate toward the famous creation lines, blood and clay, while the more mundane administrative and ritual contexts remain in shadow. The shadow then becomes a space where modern claims grow. When someone says an Akkadian tablet reveals a genetic mistake, the claim often rests on a blend of real motifs and vague references to untranslated tablets. The motif is real. Blood mixed with clay, a slain divine figure, subsequent limitations on humanity. The vagueness is where the claim escapes discipline. Untranslated can mean many things. It can mean a fragment has not been published. It can mean a text is published but not widely accessible. It can mean it is translated in academic literature but not in popular media. It can also be a rhetorical shield for invention. A careful investigation does not deny that unpublished tablets exist. They do. The scale of the corpus makes that almost inevitable, but it also does not treat unpublished as a magical category that automatically contains forbidden truths. Most unpublished pieces are unpublished because there are too many and too few specialists, or because conservation is needed, or because the text is repetitive. Sometimes the unpublished piece becomes important later when it joins with another fragment and completes a known composition. Sometimes it adds a variant line that clarifies a point, but unpublished is not synonymous with earth-shattering. The same logic applies to restricted access. Museums and collections often limit handling of fragile artifacts. Tablets can be loaned sparingly. High resolution photography might require permissions. Certain storerooms are not open to casual visitors. All of this can create an atmosphere of secrecy, especially for an audience already inclined to imagine suppression. But institutional caution has mundane explanations: preservation, staffing, funding, and the responsibility of keeping objects intact for future study. The corridor is restricted not to hide meaning, but to keep clay from turning to dust. Even so, the feeling of sealed spaces is not entirely illusion. It is built into the structure of modern scholarship. Akkadian and Sumerian require years of training. Reading a tablet from a photograph is an art that depends on experience with sign variants and damage patterns. Academic publishing can be expensive and slow. Not every edition is freely available. The barrier is not a locked vault with a guard. It is the accumulation of gates, language, time, institutional access, and the sheer volume of material. This is the modern version of the ancient compartmentalization. Knowledge remains in corridors. It is passed through training. It becomes a property of a small community. And when knowledge is unevenly distributed, stories proliferate to fill the gaps. Some of those stories are cautious, some are reckless, some are sincere attempts to translate ancient anxieties into modern terms. Others are designed to persuade, not to understand. The title's phrase, genetic mistake, belongs to that modern ecology. It uses the authority of ancient tablets to lend weight to a contemporary fascination with coded origins. It is a powerful idea because it allows a listener to feel that a very old voice has whispered something modern science only recently discovered. But the discipline of the clay demands a different approach. Rather than searching for a line that is unlikely to exist, it is more honest to ask, what in the surviving record could be misread as genetic? The answer keeps returning to the same cluster: the creation mixture, clay plus divine blood. The consequence: humans become noisy and numerous. The response: catastrophe and then limits. The technical texts: bodies read as signs, anomalies treated as warnings. The political texts: kings as boundary testers, immortality withheld. These are the materials. They can support a thesis about ancient fears of disorder, excess, and boundary erosion. They do not straightforwardly support a thesis about DNA errors. At this stage, the investigation can press closer to the phrase mistake itself, not the English word, but the conceptual space around error and deviation in Mesopotamian thought. If there are Akkadian ways to speak about something going wrong in creation, they will appear in the vocabulary of evil, disorder, badness, defect, misfortune, and taboo. Those words appear often in incantations and diagnostic texts. They also appear in royal rhetoric about enemies and rebellion. The question becomes whether any of these conceptual tools are applied specifically to humanity's origin in a way that resembles an admission of error. The evidence, as commonly published and discussed in scholarship, does not present a simple confession: we made a mistake. But it does present a persistent insistence that humans require limits, and that certain deviations are ominous. That insistence can be interpreted as the worldview's recognition that creation produces unstable outputs, and that instability must be managed. The genetic mistake idea then becomes a translation choice. It translates unstable outputs into modern science language. It translates bad signs into mutations. It translates divine blood into coded inheritance. The investigation's task is to keep the translation from hardening into false certainty. The next trace, therefore, returns to language, but in a darker register. The phrases used to describe evil and badness as forces that cling to bodies and households. In that register, the idea of something flawed at the root of a person becomes more plausible, not as DNA, but as a kind of inherited misfortune. The record may not offer genetic error, but it does offer something that can resemble it. The sense that certain families, certain lineages, certain origins carry a burden that persists across generations, like a stain that does not wash out easily. And in that sense, the fear of humans becomes personal rather than cosmic. Fear that what was mixed into clay at the beginning did not only create laborers, but created a tendency for disorder to move through bloodlines like a quiet contagion. In many Mesopotamian incantations and ritual texts, misfortune is not described as a mood, it is described as a presence. It can cling to a person like dust, settle into a house like dampness, travel along roads, gather at thresholds, and attach itself to the vulnerable places where human life is thin. Childbirth, sickness, mourning, debt, exile. The language often treats evil as something that can be carried, transferred, and removed. The human being becomes a surface where unseen forces leave residue. This vocabulary is one of the closest things the ancient record offers to the modern intuition of an embedded flaw. The flaw is not molecular, it is moral and ritual, but it behaves, in the imagination, like something inherited. A curse can pass through a family line. A taboo violation can ripple across descendants. A household's neglect of proper ritual can invite continuing trouble. The past is not past, it is active. Here, the words used for evil and badness matter because they reveal what kind of wrongness Mesopotamians feared. Akkadian terms often rendered as evil or bad do not always refer to wickedness in an ethical sense. They can refer to harm, misfortune, sickness, and disruptive forces. The world is full of hazards, and the language reflects an attempt to classify and repel them. In this frame, a mistaken origin could be understood as a built-in vulnerability. Humans were made in such a way that they are open to contamination and misfortune. This vulnerability aligns with the creation motif. Humans are clay, fragile, breakable, subject to drying and cracking. Humans contain blood from a slain figure, substance linked to conflict. Humans receive breath, life borrowed from beyond. A being made of these elements is not self-sufficient. It depends on a relationship with the divine realm that must be maintained through ritual and obligation. Break the relationship, and the protective boundary weakens. Ritual texts repeatedly return to boundaries. Doorways are washed, figurines are buried, words are spoken to drive away a presence. Water is poured, smoke is raised, offerings are placed. These actions are not performed because the practitioner expects immediate empirical proof in a modern sense. They are performed because the practitioner expects the world to respond to correct gestures, and because correct gestures are one of the few available means of stabilizing a life that can be destroyed by drought or fever without warning. This stabilization is also why fear, in these texts, often reads like vigilance. It is not a dramatic panic at human power. It is a daily awareness that a person can become wrong without intending to. A wrong word, a wrong touch, the wrong day, the wrong threshold crossed, the wrong omen ignored. The world is booby-trapped with consequences. In such a system, genetic becomes a misleading metaphor, but the metaphor's emotional function begins to make sense. Modern audiences fear hidden defects inside bodies because hidden defects feel like betrayal by one's own origin. Mesopotamian audiences feared hidden contamination and inherited curse for similar reasons. Both fear a wrongness that cannot be easily seen until it erupts. The record grows more complex when the focus turns to lineage. Mesopotamian society placed heavy weight on family and inheritance. Property passed through lines. Names carried memory. Household gods and ancestors mattered. Legal documents track adoption, marriage arrangements, and inheritance disputes with sharp detail. These documents show that lineage was a structural reality, not merely a poetic theme. Within that structure, the idea that misfortune can run through a line is especially potent. If a household is cursed, the curse threatens not only individual well-being but economic stability and social standing. A family line that cannot produce heirs is not merely tragic. It is a collapse of continuity. This is why blessings and curses often focus on seed, on offspring, on the multiplication or cutting off of a line. The language is bodily and social at once. When mythic and ritual language uses the bodily register, blood, seed, breath, it can sound almost like heredity, but the mechanism remains different. The burden is not a gene, it is a relationship to the divine realm, and that relationship can be damaged and repaired through ritual, law, and piety. In other words, the flaw is not irrevocable in principle, it can be managed. This is another reason the gods in myth impose controls rather than erasing humanity. If humans are porous, the solution is to enforce boundaries and provide mechanisms of purification, not to redesign the creature from scratch. The world is treated as adjustable through decree and ritual. Humans are treated as maintainable. Yet the same texts also reveal a darker implication. If humans require constant maintenance, then the baseline state of a human being is instability. The creation itself may be the first act of instability. Humans are not created as serene beings of perfect order. They are created as laborers with a trace of divine conflict in their substance, placed into a world where their noise can disturb gods and their anomalies can signal disaster. Their condition is precarious by design. This is where the idea of fear can be reframed as fear of recurrence. The gods defeat chaos in Enuma Elish, but chaos returns in signs and misfortune. The gods solve labor conflict in Atrahasis by creating humans, but humans become a new source of conflict through noise and numbers. The gods give kingship to humans, but kings can become tyrants or boundary testers. Again and again, solutions generate new problems. The world is not a stable machine, it is a cycle of fixes. If that is the underlying logic, then the genetic mistake becomes a kind of modern shorthand for a much older insight. Creation produces unintended consequences. The Mesopotamian record does not need DNA to articulate that insight, because it sees it everywhere. In floods, in omens, in illness, in succession crises, in the endless labor of repairing canals. The investigation now faces a choice of corridor. One corridor leads deeper into the technical omen series, to see how they treat recurring patterns and whether they ever speak of inherited predisposition. Another corridor leads into the mythic idea of deliberate limitation, mortality, because mortality is the most universal, control, and the most intimate. If the gods feared humans in any deep sense, it would be expressed not in catalogs of anomalies, but in the decision to keep humans from living too long. Mortality is not a single event. It is a policy written into every breath. It is also the point where the record's tone becomes almost tender in its restraint. Gilgamesh rages against it. Atrahasis accepts it. Ritual texts try to negotiate around it through healing. None of them fully explains why it must exist beyond the logic of boundaries. The next trace follows mortality as the ultimate boundary, the quietest wall in the archive, and the one most likely to be mistaken for a mistake because it feels to human desire like a flaw in the design of the creature itself. Mortality is the most consistent restraint in the Mesopotamian imagination, not because it is unique to Mesopotamia, but because it is treated there as an enforced boundary rather than a simple fact of nature. The epics and myths rarely portray death as an accident that happened to humans. They portray it as a condition maintained, a limit kept in place because without it something else would fail. In Atrahasis, after catastrophe, the gods do not merely walk away. They introduce measures that shape the human future. The logic can be read as population management. Shorter lives mean fewer living bodies at once, fewer mouths, fewer voices, less noise. The logic can also be read as hierarchy management. Shorter lives mean fewer chances for humans to accumulate power and memory, fewer opportunities to turn knowledge into threat. Both readings fit the broader pattern of containment without requiring modern biology. Mortality also appears as a kind of ethical architecture. In Gilgamesh, the king's struggle against death becomes the story's engine. Gilgamesh is not an ordinary man. He is unusually strong, unusually driven, and described as partly divine. If any human could claim an exemption, it would be him. The epic's refusal to grant him immortality functions like a verdict. Even the extraordinary must remain within the human allotment. The limit is not negotiable. The door is closed. In that closed door, modern listeners often hear cruelty, but the Mesopotamian record offers a different mood, one that is more resigned than outraged. The gods do not explain the limit with a moral argument. They do not say that humans do not deserve immortality because they are wicked. They simply treat immortality as a property of divinity that must not spill downward. The boundary exists because boundaries are what keep the world from dissolving back into primal disorder. This returns the investigation to the title's tension. A genetic mistake implies a flaw in the body's construction. Mortality can feel like such a flaw because it appears universal and intimate. Humans break down, minds dim, flesh fails. In a modern scientific frame, mortality is an outcome of biology. In a mythic frame, mortality is a policy. The Mesopotamian texts lean toward policy. They present death less as mechanical breakdown and more as a decree that limits human reach. If death is a decree, then fear becomes a plausible motive, not fear of what humans are now, but fear of what humans could become if time were unlimited. A being that lives forever can master systems, accumulate wealth, control institutions, and harden into something unmovable. In a world where kings already strain boundaries, an immortal king would be a permanent crisis. Even without kings, an immortal population would eventually overwhelm land and water. The Atrahasis complaint about noise would become endless. From that angle, mortality is not a punishment, it is infrastructure. The record does not state this explicitly as a theory. It demonstrates it through narrative moves. Humans grow too numerous, disaster follows. Humans survive, limits are imposed. A king seeks immortality, he is denied. A plant of rejuvenation appears, it is lost. The story does not need to say, mortality keeps you manageable. It shows manageability being restored whenever the boundary threatens to weaken. This framing also helps explain why the myths do not obsess over the mechanism of human making. The mechanism is less important than the boundary. Whether humans were shaped from clay in a basin or formed by a goddess's hands matters less than the fact that humans are assigned labor and kept mortal. The origin scene functions as a legal preface. It establishes the terms of existence. The rest of the tradition enforces those terms. The tradition's enforcement is not only mythic. Ritual practice attempts to negotiate with mortality at the margins. Healing rituals, protective incantations, and purification rites do not promise immortality, but they aim to preserve life, remove harmful forces, and restore balance. They treat illness as something that can be averted or reduced if the right gestures are made and the right words are spoken. The existence of these rituals implies that the boundary is firm but not entirely opaque. Life can be extended, danger can be delayed, misfortune can be pushed back. That pushback is another place where modern interpretations can overreach. Where there are rituals for healing and protection, a modern mind may imagine hidden medical knowledge or a proto-scientific model of disease. It is plausible that practical observation informed many remedies. But the ritual texts also show that the culture understood vulnerability as part of the human design. Humans can be protected because they are exposed. They can be cleansed because they can be contaminated. The baseline state is openness. Openness is the opposite of a sealed machine. It is also the opposite of the modern fantasy that genes are destiny. In the Mesopotamian worldview, destiny exists, but it is not necessarily locked into flesh alone. Destiny can be influenced by ritual, by piety, by correct timing, by the favor of a god, by the intercession of a goddess, by the avoidance of taboo. The human being is not a closed code, it is a relationship. That relationship can be damaged, it can be repaired, it can be negotiated, though never fully controlled. This is where the phrase genetic mistake becomes not only inaccurate, but almost backward. It imagines a human origin that is technically precise, but flawed in a small way. The Mesopotamian record suggests a human origin that is ritually potent but inherently precarious. The precariousness is not a bug. It is a feature of a world that depends on hierarchy and constant maintenance. Still, the feeling of a mistake does not disappear, because the texts themselves often carry a muted sorrow about human limits. Gilgamesh's grief is not mocked. It is honored with attention. The epic does not say his desire is foolish. It says his desire meets a wall. The sorrow is the human response to the boundary. and it is allowed to exist in the narrative without being resolved. That allowance creates the final kind of gap the investigation must address. If humans were created to work and die, why do the texts spend so much time giving voice to human longing? Longing for permanence, for meaning, for a name that lasts. The answer may be that longing is the engine that produces civilization. The building of walls, the writing of tablets, the raising of temples, the carving of steles. If humans were not restless, the world would be quieter. The gods would sleep. The cities might never rise. In that sense, the very trait that makes humans difficult, restlessness, also makes humans valuable. A perfectly obedient, perfectly quiet workforce might not create the splendor that the gods are said to enjoy. Temples filled with offerings, hymns, incense, and the steady labor of maintenance. The myths do not say this plainly, but the archive implies it. Civilization is built by beings who cannot fully accept their limits. The gods restrain humans, yet depend on their striving. This dependence complicates the idea of fear. Fear and need can coexist. A ruler can fear a crowd and still rely on it for labor. A god can be disturbed by noise and still demand worship. A system can require a force that it must constantly manage. The contradiction does not resolve, it deepens. The next trace moves into that deepening contradiction, where striving becomes not only personal, as in Gilgamesh, but institutional. The scribal schools, the scholars, and the experts who attempted to read the world's signs and keep order through knowledge. In those schools, tablets were not merely preserved. They were used to train minds that could become dangerous precisely because they could interpret the sealed spaces of fate. In Mesopotamia, the most powerful tool was not bronze or chariot. It was literacy. A person who could press signs into clay could make promises permanent, turn grain into counted wealth, and turn a king's will into a document that outlived the king. The ability to write did not belong to everyone. It belonged to trained specialists, formed in schools that were both practical and secretive by nature, not because they hid forbidden truths, but because expertise itself is a kind of enclosure. The scribal school was a sealed space made of routine. Students learned sign lists. They copied proverbs. They repeated model contracts. They practiced lexical series that mapped the world into columns of terms: trees, stones, animals, professions, parts of the body. These lists look dry, but they reveal something essential. Knowledge was accumulated as inventory. The world was turned into categories. The student's mind became a storeroom. Within that storeroom, myths were not simply stories. They were exercises. Literary texts were copied and memorized alongside technical series. An apprentice might move from counting rations to copying the lines of Atrahasis, from legal formulas to laments and hymns, from epics to omen compendia. The result was a class of people who could move between registers: administration, ritual, poetry, divination. They could translate the world into writing and then translate writing back into action. This is where the idea of restricted corridors becomes sharp. A corridor is not always a hallway. Sometimes it is a curriculum. To enter certain texts, a student had to pass through layers of preparation. Technical corpora, omen series, ritual manuals, specialized lexical lists were not readable to the untrained. They were written in dense sign forms, full of abbreviations and specialized terms. The barrier was not a padlock. The barrier was difficulty. In that difficulty, a new kind of fear becomes visible. Fear of knowledge itself, not as enlightenment, but as a force that can destabilize. If the world is full of signs and only a few can read them, those few become dangerous. They can advise kings. They can interpret portents. They can justify policy. They can also be wrong, and a wrong interpretation can ruin a reign. The record shows that scholars were often close to power. Courts depended on omen experts and ritual specialists to navigate uncertainty. When an eclipse occurred, it was not merely a beautiful event, it was a message. When an unusual birth happened, it was not merely tragedy, it was a warning. In such a system, Interpretation becomes governance. This proximity to governance explains why knowledge could be both valued and constrained. A court might preserve tablets obsessively while also controlling who handled them. A temple might maintain a library while also restricting it to certain ranks. A scholar might copy a series faithfully while also placing a colophon that names ownership and lineage of learning. The purpose is not necessarily to hide cosmic secrets, it is to protect authority and continuity. Knowledge is power, and power is managed. From the modern perspective, this looks like the perfect environment for hidden revelations. If texts are difficult, if training is narrow, if access is limited, then perhaps some explosive claim could be tucked away. The phrase genetic mistake slips easily into that fantasy. But the more disciplined reading is that the most hidden thing is not a secret about DNA. It is the sheer complexity of the intellectual world itself. The fact that Mesopotamian scholarship was vast, systematic, and comfortable with uncertainty, yet also comfortable with asserting correspondences without explaining mechanisms. This comfort creates the same kind of gap seen in omen literature. The series provide conditions and outcomes, but rarely provide theory. A student learns that a sign means something because tradition says so, because a teacher says so, because the tablets say so. The authority is inherited. The reasoning remains mostly sealed. In modern science, sealed reasoning is suspicious. In ancient scholarship, sealed reasoning can be normal. It can even be protective. If the world is dangerous and the gods are volatile, one does not casually publicize every piece of knowledge. One preserves it within institutions that can maintain it. A temple archive is a kind of safe. A school is a gate. This framing makes the creation myths feel different. Atrahasis and Enuma Elish might have been copied in schools not to reveal origins as an open question, but to fix origins as a closed answer. Humans are made for labor. The gods are owed service. The hierarchy is legitimate. In that sense, the myths themselves are tools of containment. They contain interpretation, they direct it toward duty. And yet, the very act of training scribes to copy and interpret could produce an unintended surplus. A mind trained to read signs cannot always stop reading. A mind trained to categorize the world can begin to question the categories. A scholar who knows multiple versions of a myth can notice that the record does not agree with itself. A student who copies Atrahasis alongside Enuma Elish can see the shared motif of a slain divine figure and begin to wonder what it implies. The school does not encourage rebellion, but it produces the capacity for it. This is the quiet irony at the center of the title's contradiction. The culture that insisted on boundaries also built institutions that sharpened human cognition. The gods demanded worship and order, yet relied on humans to maintain the writing systems, rituals, and administrative structures that made order possible. The more humans learned, the more complicated management became. If there is any ancient analog to "they feared us," it may lie here. Not in fear of human muscle, but in fear of human interpretation. A workforce that can read and write is not a simple workforce. It can keep accounts. It can record debts. It can preserve grievances. It can transmit ideas across generations. It can make memory permanent in clay. It can, in other words, reduce the god's advantage of forgetfulness. A mortal being that remembers too well becomes different. Mortality limits the body, but writing extends the mind beyond the body. A king dies, but his inscriptions remain. A scholar dies, but his tablets remain. A city falls, but its fired library remains buried until another era uncovers it. Writing is the human answer to death, and it is also the thing that makes human noise continue even after the voice is gone. This is why the archive feels haunted. The tablets are not only records, they are defiance in slow motion. They refuse to vanish. They whisper from sealed rooms. They carry ancient anxieties into modern hands. And because they survive in fragments, they provoke imagination. The missing lines invite modern terms. The sealed reasoning invites modern suspicion. The restricted corridors invite modern myths about forbidden knowledge. Yet the clay does not cooperate with clean modern fantasies. It offers complexity, not confession. It offers a world where humans were made from clay and divine blood to serve, then constrained when they grew too loud. It offers a culture that read bodies as signs, treated misfortune as presents, and built institutions to manage uncertainty through ritual and scholarship. It offers a system that feared disorder, not necessarily human superiority. The next trace follows one of the most modern of all distortions: the way later eras, including the present, have used Mesopotamian material to build stories about hidden origins, stories that often ignore the slow, institutional nature of both ancient and modern knowledge. In that modern reuse, the genetic mistake becomes less a claim about Akkad and more a symptom of a contemporary hunger to find a single coded sentence that explains why being human feels like living with a flaw. And that hunger, too, has its own corridors, some open, some sealed, and some designed to look like doors while leading nowhere. In the modern afterlife of Mesopotamian myth, certain phrases repeat like charms: lost knowledge, forbidden tablets, untranslated archives. They hid the truth. The phrases thrive because the real situation is already complicated. Fragments scattered across collections, slow publication, specialist languages, and the genuine fact that much remains unread by most people. A complicated reality offers just enough shadow for simpler stories to move through it. One of those simpler stories is the idea that ancient texts describe deliberate genetic engineering. The argument often begins with the creation mixture, clay plus divine blood. It then borrows the modern concept of genetic code and treats blood as a stand-in for inheritable information. From there, the argument points to the later controls: shortened lifespans, regulated birth, as if those were signs that the creators needed to correct an engineering error. Finally, it gestures toward the divine complaint about human noise as proof that the makers regretted what they had made. This chain is not irrational. It is a modern attempt to make the ancient material speak in a modern key. The problem is that each link depends on translation choices that the Akkadian record does not compel. Blood can be inheritance in a modern idiom, but in these texts it is also guilt, vitality, and sacrificial transfer. Seed can be genetics in a modern idiom, but in these texts it is also lineage, posterity, and social continuity. Control can be genetic editing in a modern idiom, but in these texts it is also decree, ritual, and law. The ancient world has a different causal map, and that map cannot be replaced without losing what the texts actually do. There is also a softer issue. Modern genetic engineering readings often treat myth as encrypted reportage. They assume the story hides a literal event beneath symbolism. Some researchers in comparative mythology and ancient religion would resist that approach. They would argue that myth is not a coded lab notebook, but a cultural machine. It organizes power, legitimizes institutions, and gives humans a language for anxiety, obligation, and limits. In that view, the creation myths say what they need to say openly. Humans exist for labor and worship, and the hierarchy must be maintained. The blood and clay are not technical details. They are theological and social claims made tangible. Other scholars might allow that myth can preserve memories of real events in distorted form, but they would still be cautious about turning those distortions into precise modern technologies. The ancient Near East was capable of astonishing practical knowledge in agriculture, engineering, and administration, but that does not mean its myths are evidence of molecular science. The burden of proof for such a leap is high, and the Cuneiform texts, as commonly published and debated, do not meet it. Even within popular readings, the phrase genetic mistake is often more of an emotional diagnosis than an evidentiary one. It names a feeling that humans contain something contradictory, a hunger for meaning and a capacity for harm, a drive to build and a drive to ruin. The modern term mistake gives that contradiction a single origin point. It suggests one flaw at the beginning, one wrong stitch in the pattern. The Mesopotamian record offers a different picture. The contradiction is not hidden in a single origin defect. It is built into the role assigned to humans. Humans are made to sustain divine rest, yet their multiplication disturbs rest. Humans are made from divine substance, yet they are kept mortal. Humans are given kingship, yet kings must not cross divine thresholds. Humans are taught to read signs, yet the world's signs warn that order is always threatened. The tension is structural, not accidental. The system runs because of human striving, and the system threatens to break because of human striving. This is why the popular modern hypothesis of fear, they feared us, can be both wrong and revealing. It is wrong if it implies that gods trembled before human biological superiority. It is revealing if it points to the real anxiety embedded in the texts, anxiety about boundary failure. The gods, as literary figures, do not behave like engineers afraid of their experiment. They behave like rulers afraid of noise, excess, and the return of chaos. They behave like a governing body whose solutions keep generating new problems. The modern obsession with untranslated tablets often intensifies this misreading. It implies that somewhere in storage, there's a decisive tablet that will settle everything. But the nature of the corpus argues against that expectation. Mesopotamian literature tends to preserve themes through repetition and variation, rather than through a single definitive statement. If a worldview held an explosive secret, it would likely leave more than one trace. It would echo in multiple compositions in multiple genres over centuries. What echoes across genres is not genetic engineering. What echoes is hierarchy, labor, and limitation. That does not mean the modern imagination must be dismissed. It means it must be redirected toward what the texts genuinely offer. The real mystery is not a missing genetic formula. The real mystery is how a civilization so committed to order also produced stories haunted by the fragility of order. The gap in the record that shouldn't exist is not a missing laboratory paragraph. It is the persistent absence of reassurance. The texts do not promise that the system is kind. They do not promise that the limits are fair. They simply describe the limits, enforce them, and then record human longing against them. In that atmosphere, modern audiences reach for genetics because genetics feels like a hard floor beneath experience. If suffering has an origin in code, it is at least comprehensible. If restlessness is a mutation, it is at least nameable. The ancient record, by contrast, offers an origin in decree and sacrifice, origins that do not explain in a way modern minds accept. Decree feels arbitrary. Sacrifice feels morally dark. Noise feels like a strange reason to drown a world. The mind seeks another explanation because it cannot bear the ancient one without reshaping it. Yet the ancient explanation may be the point. Atrahasis and Enuma Elish do not describe a benevolent design. They describe a design born from conflict and maintained by constraint. Humans are not framed as the crown of creation. They are framed as the solution to a labor problem and the maintenance staff of a divine regime. That framing is uncomfortable, but it is historically meaningful. It reflects a society where labor was heavy, where kingship was absolute, where drought and flood could kill without warning, and where order felt like something that had to be fought for every season. If the record seems to fear humans, it may be because it mirrors the way human institutions feared their own populations. The god's complaint about noise resembles a ruler's complaint about unrest. The imposition of limits resembles a state's attempt to regulate bodies through law, ritual, and coercion. Myth and politics braid together until the boundary between divine governance and human governance becomes hard to see. In that braid, fear is not cosmic paranoia. It is the ordinary anxiety of power trying to preserve itself. The investigation, therefore, reaches a late threshold. The modern hypothesis can be acknowledged as a cultural phenomenon, but it cannot be granted the authority of the tablets without stronger evidence than the corpus provides. What can be pursued, instead, is the deeper and stranger question that the tablets do support. Why did Mesopotamian thought repeatedly return to the idea that human life must be limited, purified, and managed, even as it depended on humans for everything? The next trace turns toward the most symbolic element of all, clay itself. Clay is the medium of human creation and myth and the medium of human memory and reality. Humans are said to be shaped from clay. Their stories are preserved in clay. Their debts and prayers and laments are pressed into clay. The same substance that makes the human body a narrative becomes the archive that outlives the body. In that mirror, the final corridor opens, quietly, into a reflection where the mistake is no longer a claim about biology, but a question about what it means to be made from a material that can hold form only by drying and can hold memory only by being fired by catastrophe. Clay is an ordinary substance until it is asked to bear weight. In Mesopotamia, it bore almost everything: walls, seals, bricks, bowls, figurines, tablets. It was the earth lifted into form. It was the river's gift shaped by hands. It was also the most fragile kind of permanence because it could return to mud with a little water, or crack into dust with time, unless something happened to harden it. This is why clay feels like the most honest symbol in the archive. In the myths, humans are clay made upright, formed, animated, assigned. In the museums, the human voice survives as clay pressed with wedges. The same substance that is said to become flesh becomes the medium that outlasts flesh. The parallel is so tight it feels intentional, even if it emerged by accident. It is as if the culture wrote its anthropology into its technology without noticing. To be human is to be shaped, to dry, to crack, to break, and sometimes to endure. The title's idea of a genetic mistake begins to look different when clay is allowed to take center stage. A mistake, in a modern sense, is a wrong instruction in a code. Clay does not work that way. Clay works through pressure and form. It holds what is pressed into it. It does not distinguish between intended lines and accidental marks. It preserves the gesture, not the intention. A hurried scribe's slip can become permanent. A careful scribe's perfect line can still be broken by a fall. In clay, error and design sit side by side, equal under the same drying sun. If the Mesopotamian myths were written by hands that knew clay intimately, then their portrayal of humans as clay carries an embedded realism. Clay can be shaped into a vessel, but the vessel must be fired or it will soften. Clay can hold form, but it is vulnerable to water and time. Clay can be repaired, but the repair leaves a seam. A clay thing can be useful, but it requires maintenance. In this sense, the human condition described by the myths, labor, vulnerability, need for ritual repair, fits the material logic of clay better than it fits the logic of engineered perfection. The creation myths that speak of blood and breath added to clay do not offer a blueprint. They offer a paradox, a low substance made animate by a higher one. That paradox becomes a source of tension throughout the record. The low substance keeps pulling downward into mortality and fragility. The higher substance keeps pushing upward into longing, speech, memory, and restlessness. The gods respond by enforcing limits, not because a molecule went wrong, but because the mixture produces beings who will not stay simple. The noise in Atrahasis can be heard again here, but more softly. It is not only physical sound. It is the noise of human presence refusing to be temporary in the way clay wants to be temporary. It is the noise of cities insisting on permanence in a landscape that floods and dries and shifts. It is the noise of kings carving names into stone to outlast death. It is the noise of scribes pressing words into clay to outlast kings. It is the noise of the human drive to leave a mark. In that drive, the god's irritation begins to resemble something less personal and more structural. A system built on hierarchy must keep those marks within bounds. It must keep the human mark from becoming a divine mark. It must keep the human name from becoming immortal in the way a god's name is immortal. And yet, the system also relies on the human mark to exist at all, because temples, offerings, rituals, and archives require labor and record keeping. The divine realm, in its literary imagination, wants rest, but rest requires constant human motion. This is the contradiction the record never resolves, and perhaps cannot resolve without breaking its own world. Humans are created to serve, yet their serving creates civilization, and civilization creates density, and density creates disturbance. Humans are made with a trace of divine substance, yet the trace produces speech and memory and longing, and those qualities generate unrest. The gods manage humans, yet the act of management requires humans capable of understanding management. The system is caught in its own loop. The modern fantasy of a genetic mistake tries to simplify this loop by locating the contradiction in one point of origin. It suggests that if the code were corrected, the rest would settle. The Mesopotamian material suggests something harsher and quieter. The contradiction is not a single wrong letter. It is the cost of making a being capable of building order in a world where order is never free. Even the technical corpora, omens, diagnoses, rituals, support that view when listened to without forcing them into modern science. They do not describe a body as a stable machine. They describe a body as a surface where forces write and erase. They do not describe anomalies as random errors. They describe anomalies as messages that the boundary has shifted. They do not describe fate as fixed solely inside flesh. They describe fate as a network of relations that can be damaged and repaired, but never fully mastered. In that network, fear is not a cinematic emotion. It is the constant awareness of fragility. It is the vigilance that keeps thresholds clean, keeps rituals correct, keeps kings attentive to signs, keeps communities remembering obligations. Fear is part of maintenance. It is the feeling that warns the system where it will crack if pressure increases. And yet, despite all of this vigilance, the archive itself teaches that maintenance fails. Cities fell, temples burned, libraries collapsed, tablets shattered, names were rubbed away. What survived often survived because disaster fired clay hard enough to endure. The very catastrophes that myths describe as divine interventions became, in the material world, the means by which those myths reach the future. The record is preserved by the forces it fears. That irony is the last whisper the clay offers. A library meant to control knowledge is preserved by its destruction. A tablet meant to fix order survives as a fragment that invites doubt. A story meant to justify hierarchy survives into an age that questions it. The sealed rooms open, but only after they have been buried. The maps change, but the wedges remain. So the question of a mistake returns to its quietest form. If there is a mistake, it may not be in human DNA, because the texts do not speak of DNA. It may not even be in the god's recipe, because the myths present the mixture as purposeful. The mistake may be the expectation that a created being can be both alive enough to sustain a world and quiet enough to never disturb it. The mistake may be the hope that order can be maintained without producing the very restlessness that makes order possible. Clay remembers the pressure of the hand, not the intention of the mind. It remembers the stroke that was meant and the stroke that slipped. It remembers without judgment. It holds the shape until it breaks, and even when it breaks, it holds enough of the shape that someone can try to reconstruct the whole. That is what the archive does to humanity itself. It does not provide a final explanation. It provides fragments that carry the weight of a vanished world, and it invites a later world to press its own questions into the gaps. In the end, the fear that seems to hover around these stories does not point cleanly toward a secret engineering project. It points towards something older and more universal, the recognition that to create is to invite consequence, that to give breath to clay is to accept noise, and that to build a world on fragile bodies is to live with cracks as part of the design. The tablets do not close the door on that recognition. They leave it ajar, like a room in a ruined palace where dust has settled on the last footprints and where the silence does not answer, but still feels alive.